I discovered that my business partner had forged my signature to drain nearly $90,000 from our employee's retirement fund and cover his gambling losses. My name is Odalys Castellano, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. For most of my adult life, I believed that if you built a business with the right person, trusted that person, and divided responsibilities in a way that matched each of your strengths, the machine would keep running on something sturdier than suspicion. I believed that if one partner handled operations and finance while the other handled clients and creative direction, then the work would balance out naturally. I believed that mutual trust was not only a nice idea, but a practical necessity when you were trying to keep a small company alive in a market that punished hesitation and rewarded attention to detail. I do not believe that anymore. I learned why the hard way, through a phone call that began as a routine compliance question and ended with me staring at a stack of retirement plan paperwork and wondering how many times my own name had been used as a weapon against the people who worked for us. Thaddeus and I had built our agency from almost nothing. We were a 10-person marketing company operating out of a converted office suite on the third floor of an old building downtown, with mismatched chairs, too many whiteboards, and the kind of optimism that only comes from being too busy to think about failure. 8 years earlier, when we first started, we were both exhausted in different ways. He had come out of a larger firm where he hated the bureaucracy. I had spent years working for clients who wanted results but never understood the actual labor that produced them. We met through a mutual contact on a project that should have been too small to matter, and by the end of it we both knew the same thing. We worked well together. Thaddeus was the calm one in meetings, the one who could talk down an angry client, the one who knew where every invoice stood and what every vendor wanted. He had a way of making details sound simple, which was useful because I had a way of making ideas sound bigger than they were. I could sell a vision, shape a message, and turn a half-formed concept into something a client could see and approve. He could keep the books straight, make sure payroll cleared, and follow the trail of every payment until the numbers made sense. It was a good partnership because it seemed efficient, and because efficiency can look a lot like trust when you are young enough and busy enough not to ask too many hard questions. 5 years into the business, after a stretch of strong growth and a surprisingly smooth tax season, we decided to set up a modest retirement plan for the staff. At the time, it felt like a milestone. We were no longer a scrappy little startup improvising our way through every month. We had benefits, we had a 401k, we had employees who were starting to talk about contributing enough to matter, and I remember feeling proud that we had reached a point where the agency could offer something stable instead of just promising people a future. Our team was small, but everyone on it mattered. We had designers, account managers, media buyers, a bookkeeper, and a junior coordinator who brought in homemade pastries on Fridays and somehow kept our office from becoming a place where people only spoke in deadlines. Thaddeus took on most of the administrative side because he already handled the back office. That decision never seemed risky at the time. It seemed logical. He was the partner who liked paperwork more than I did, if liking it is even the right word. He tolerated forms, deadlines, compliance requirements, and vendor calls with the patience of someone who understood that every business survives by making peace with bureaucracy. I was grateful for that. In our division of labor, I got to be the visible face of the company while he took on the less glamorous machinery that kept the lights on. The retirement plan was administered by a third-party firm, which was supposed to be the safeguard. That was the whole point, or at least that was how I understood it. A professional administrator would handle the plan, make sure filings were correct, and flag anything unusual. We had internal procedures too. Any loan or withdrawal request against plan assets required both of our authorizations. It was a rule we had put into our governing documents because, even then, we recognized that no one person should be able to touch employee retirement savings on a whim. I had signed those documents myself. I had read enough of the fine print to know the plan was limited, and I had felt relieved that the safeguards existed. What I did not know was that safeguards only work if someone respects them. The call came on a Tuesday morning in the middle of a week that otherwise looked ordinary. I had just finished a client check-in and was still standing near the conference room window with a lukewarm coffee when the administrator's number appeared on my phone. I remember thinking it was probably a routine clarification, maybe something about a filing deadline or a participant question. Instead, the woman on the line introduced herself, confirmed my identity, and told me that during a compliance review, they had noticed a pattern of withdrawal requests that needed to be verified. The phrase sounded harmless enough at first, but the moment she said, "withdrawal requests," I felt something tighten in my chest. She explained that the plan had received several loan requests against the assets, which in itself was not automatically improper because some retirement plans allow participant loans under specific conditions. But in our case, any request involving plan assets had to be signed and approved by both business owners. The administrator had found multiple documents bearing my signature. She was calling because, based on the review, they believed the signature might have been authorized improperly. I remember turning away from the window, away from the rest of the office, because the sound of my own breathing suddenly felt too loud. The administrator asked me whether I had recently approved loan requests totaling close to $90,000. 90,000. The number landed with a physical force. It was not just large, it was absurd. It was the kind of number that should have come with explanation, a capital purchase, a payroll emergency, something you could point to and say, yes, that is why money moved. $90,000 was not a rounding error. It was not a mistake someone made while changing invoice codes. It was enough to change the shape of a small company's future if it disappeared. More than that, it was money tied to our employees' retirement savings. That detail cut deepest of all. It meant we were not talking about a bank line or a business loan or a temporary personal favor between partners. We were talking about funds that belonged to people who trusted us to protect them. I told her no. Not maybe. Not I need to check. Just no. I said I had not approved any withdrawals, and I asked her to send me every document they had flagged, along with copies of the signatures and any internal notes connected to the review. I made myself sound calm, because that is what you do when the world has suddenly tilted. If you panic immediately, you lose the ability to think clearly. I knew I needed to understand what I was looking at before I said one word to Thaddeus. The administrator was polite but obviously concerned. She said she would send the documents and that the issue might turn out to be a simple authorization mismatch. I knew from the tone in her voice that she did not believe that was likely. When I hung up, I stood very still in the middle of my office for several seconds, holding my phone and staring at nothing. Then I sat down, opened my laptop, and tried to remember the last time Thaddeus and I had talked about the retirement plan in a way that might explain this. At first I came up blank. Then details started surfacing in ugly little fragments. A comment from him about cleaning up some admin items. A request that I sign a packet of routine documents without reading every page, because the administrator already checked the formatting. A casual mention that he had taken care of the annual paperwork. None of it had seemed unusual enough to stop and examine. In hindsight, it all felt like a trail left by someone who knew exactly which assumptions I would make. I did not confront him right away. I wanted to, badly. The urge to march into his office and demand an explanation was almost overwhelming. But something in me understood that if I exploded too early, I might lose the chance to see the shape of the fraud. So I called the administrator back and asked her to send me the actual copies. I told her I needed time to review the documents before I spoke to anyone else. She said she understood, though I could tell she thought I was already several steps behind where I needed to be. I spent the rest of the day pretending to work while waiting for the email. I answered calls. I approved creative mock-ups. I nodded at a client who thought we were discussing campaign strategy while my mind was spinning in a completely different direction. Every so often I would glance toward Thaddeus's office, expecting him to emerge with some explanation before the documents arrived. He never did. He was in a meeting for most of the afternoon, and then disappeared briefly to grab lunch, returning with a paper bag and a coffee, as though he were just another man in a normal workday, not my business partner and maybe my biggest liability. The documents came in within 2 days. I opened them in my office with the blinds half closed and the door locked. The first thing I noticed was that the signature on each loan request looked almost right. That was what made the whole thing worse. It was not some clumsy forgery that would have stood out at a glance. Whoever had copied my name understood the general flow of my handwriting. The letters were shaped correctly enough that a casual reviewer might have let them pass. But once I compared them to genuine signatures on contracts and tax filings, the differences became impossible to ignore. The slant was off. The pressure was wrong. One loop was too tight, another too loose. A stroke I usually extended was clipped short in a way no honest signature of mine would ever be. It was the kind of mistake someone makes when they are trying to imitate a signature from memory or a photocopy, not from habit. I sat there looking at my own name as if it belonged to somebody else. There were multiple requests, spaced across months, each one just under a threshold that seemed designed to avoid attracting too much attention. That bothered me almost as much as the fake signature itself. It meant somebody had not just slipped once. Somebody had built a system. Somebody had made calculations. Somebody had been thinking ahead. I called Thaddeus's office line twice and let it ring out. Then I stopped. If I confronted him immediately, maybe he would deny everything and I would be left with a lie, a conflict, and no documentation. I needed advice, and I needed it from someone who understood exactly how serious this could be. The attorney I called was Priscilla Nakamura, a benefits and fiduciary fraud specialist whose name had been given to me years earlier by another business owner after a messy employee dispute. I had never expected to need her. When I reached her office, I tried to keep my voice steady while I explained the situation. I told her about the administrator's call, the signatures, the amount involved, and the fact that the plan assets belonged to employees who had never agreed to any of this. She did not interrupt me, which somehow made the conversation more frightening. When I finished, she asked me one question first. Did I have any reason to believe Thaddeus was in financial distress? I started to answer no, then stopped, because suddenly I was not sure. Looking back, there had been tiny things. He had started ordering more delivery lunches instead of going out. He had become oddly impatient about his personal spending, though I had assumed he was just trying to save money for something. He had made a few jokes about bad timing and a rough patch that I had laughed off because they did not sound like confessions. He had also been more secretive with his phone lately, turning it face down on the table when we met in the conference room. At the time I had chalked it up to private stress, maybe a family issue. I had not thought to push. Priscilla told me to preserve every document, every email, and every internal record connected to the retirement plan. Then she told me to bring in a forensic accountant. His name was Cornelius Akby, and he specialized in tracing asset movements when money had been pulled through layers of ordinary-looking transactions. He was the sort of person who could make a spreadsheet feel like a crime scene reconstruction. He met me in my office 2 days after I called him, carrying a laptop bag and the expression of someone who had already seen too many ways people lie with numbers. I showed him the loan requests and the administrator's notes. He did not react much at first. He just asked for account access, transaction histories, and every record we had related to the disbursements. Then he asked whether Thaddeus had exclusive access to any of the administrative credentials for the plan. I told him he had handled most of it, yes, because he was the one who had stayed in contact with the payroll vendor and the administrator. Cornelius gave me a look that was not quite pity but close. If someone wants to move money without being noticed, he said, they usually make themselves look indispensable first. That sentence stayed with me. The investigation began quietly. There was no dramatic raid, no instant revelation. Just weeks of data extraction, account comparisons, timestamp analysis, and pattern matching. Cornelius worked like a machine, but even he needed time. He traced each loan request to the exact date it was processed, matched it against the amount deposited or transferred afterward, and began following the path downstream. I learned more than I ever wanted to know about how money can be broken into smaller pieces, moved through intermediary accounts, and routed into places that seem harmless until you connect the dots. The dots connected to online gambling platforms. Not one, several. The first time Cornelius showed me the preliminary trace, I remember thinking I had misread it. Gambling? It felt almost too stereotypical, too almost dramatic to be real. But the more he dug, the more obvious the pattern became. Deposits had gone into betting accounts over the course of the previous year, and the amounts were not random. They escalated. The early transactions were relatively modest, the kind of money somebody might rationalize as entertainment. Then, as losses piled up, the withdrawals from the plan got larger, and the deposits followed suit. Cornelius said the pattern looked like someone chasing a loss spiral. That phrase made the room go cold. He explained that gamblers in the middle of a severe problem often do not act like people making a single bad decision. They act like people trying to outrun the consequences of 100 bad decisions by making one more. They tell themselves they can recover if they just keep going. They borrow from one place to cover another place. They rationalize every step because the alternative is admitting they have already gone too far. By the time the pattern becomes visible from the outside, it has usually been in motion for months. The longer he worked, the clearer the structure became. Thaddeus had not simply stumbled into this. He had arranged the withdrawals so they remained below internal review thresholds that might have triggered additional scrutiny from the administrator. He had staggered the requests over several months. He had used one loan to cover the gap created by the previous one. And when repayment deadlines came due, instead of repaying the plan the way he was supposed to, he had requested another withdrawal. It was not an accident. It was a chain. I remember staring at a chart Cornelius built that linked the dates of the loan requests to the gambling deposits, and realizing how much planning had gone into hiding something that, if he had asked me plainly, might have shattered our partnership, but still would have left room for truth. Instead, he had chosen theft and forgery. He had chosen our employees' retirement money as the thing he was willing to risk to delay his own humiliation. For 4 weeks, the three of us lived on different versions of reality. Cornelius lived in the world of transaction histories and traceable facts. Priscilla lived in the world of statutes, liabilities, and damage control. Thaddeus and I still lived in the office, in client meetings, in project timelines, in the ordinary rhythm of work. That was the strangest part. We would be discussing a brand refresh, a holiday campaign, or a quarterly proposal, and then one of us would say something about lunch or a file deadline as if nothing were wrong. We were both professionals. That meant we could keep our voices level even while the floor beneath us was cracking. Every time he smiled across the table, I wanted to ask him if he knew I had copies of his forged documents in my desk drawer. Every time he asked me a question about staffing or scheduling, I wanted to tell him I was tracing stolen money through gambling sites while he sat 3 feet away pretending to be above suspicion. At one point during that period, he mentioned, almost casually, that he had been stressed about some personal stuff lately. I remember the exact tone. It was light, almost apologetic, the kind of line someone uses to explain why they are a little distracted without inviting follow-up. At the time, before the investigation was complete, it sounded like the vague complaint of a tired business owner. Afterward, it sounded like a crack in a wall. I could not stop replaying it. Was it a test? A warning? A way of measuring whether I would press him? Or was it the closest he had come to admitting that he was already drowning? I did not ask. Not then. Priscilla had been very clear that I needed to let Cornelius finish before confronting Thaddeus. If I only had forged signatures, he could claim I had verbally approved the requests, or that the administrator had misunderstood the paperwork. If I moved too early, he might destroy records, warn someone, or bury whatever proof remained. I hated the waiting. I hated seeing him walk around the office with his usual confidence, while my stomach twisted itself into knots. But I understood the advice. The case needed structure. A single missing signature was one thing. A year-long pattern of withdrawals leading directly to gambling losses was something else entirely. When Cornelius finally told me he had enough to reconstruct the whole trail, I felt less relieved than I expected. Relief would have implied the problem was over. It was not. The office conference room was where we confronted him. Priscilla sat at the head of the table with a stack of documents organized in precise piles. Cornelius had his laptop open beside a printed timeline that mapped every request, every deposit, and every transfer. I sat across from Thaddeus and had the shocking sensation that I was looking at a stranger wearing my business partner's face. He came in expecting a regular meeting. I could tell by the way he set his notebook down and asked what the agenda was. Priscilla did not waste time. She told him the retirement plan had been reviewed, the signature documents had been verified, and the transactions had been traced. She slid the first request across the table and asked him to look at the signature. He looked at it for maybe 2 seconds before his posture changed. Not dramatically. He did not leap up or deny it instantly. He just went still in a way that told me he knew exactly what was happening. Cornelius pushed the timeline toward him and pointed to the transactions leading from the plan to the gambling accounts. Thaddeus covered his face with one hand. That was when the confession started. He did not start by denying. He started by saying he had never meant for it to get this far. I remember that phrase because it is one of the oldest sentences people use when they have already crossed a line they cannot uncross. Never meant for it to get this far. As if distance from the decision somehow made the decision less real. He admitted the gambling had been going on for almost 2 years. He said it started as a distraction, then became a habit, then became something he thought he could control because he had gone through a brief run of wins early on. He said the wins were the problem, not the losses, because the wins convinced him he was smarter than the odds. He said he had started chasing those first good outcomes, and by the time the losses stacked up, he was hiding them from himself as much as from anyone else. He talked about personal savings disappearing. He talked about credit cards getting maxed out. He talked about telling himself he could fix it before I ever noticed. He said the first loan request against the retirement plan had felt like a temporary bridge. Then the next one became necessary because the first one had created a hole. After that, the whole thing became a desperate cycle. I asked him why he forged my signature. He looked at me then, and for the first time since I had known him, he seemed genuinely ashamed. Because you would never have approved it, he said. The bluntness of that answer hurt more than I expected. He said he knew I would never agree to take anything from employee retirement savings for his personal losses. He said he knew I would stop him the minute I realized what he was doing. He said he had tried to convince himself that if he could just stabilize the situation before I found out, he could replace everything and tell me afterward. He said that in the beginning he had actually believed he could make it whole before anyone was hurt. That, in itself, was almost insulting. Because by the time he was sitting in front of us, the money had already been taken. The employees' accounts had already been touched. The plan had already been exposed to risk. His idea of making it whole was just another way of saying he wanted to keep the truth hidden long enough to save himself. I asked him if he had ever intended to tell me. He did not answer for a long time. Then he said quietly that he had hoped it would never come to this. That was not an answer either. Priscilla ended the discussion after that. She told him the Department of Labor would be notified, that the matter involved ERISA violations, forgery, and misuse of employee benefit assets, and that the company would take immediate steps to protect the employees' accounts. She told him he had already made the decisions that mattered, and now the legal process would take over. The rest happened quickly, though by then it felt as if time had become viscous. Priscilla filed the necessary notices. The Department of Labor became involved because once employee retirement funds are mishandled, it is not simply an internal dispute between business partners. It becomes a regulatory issue. The law treats those assets seriously for a reason. Those savings belong to workers who may have no idea anything is wrong until years later if no one catches it. That is why misuse of plan assets cuts so deep. It is not only theft, it is betrayal of a duty. We moved to restore the missing amounts as quickly as possible. That process was humiliating in a way I still struggle to describe. It meant explaining to our staff that there had been an issue with the retirement plan, while carefully avoiding spreading panic before we had the situation under control. It meant admitting enough to be honest without turning the office into a rumor factory. It meant sitting with people whose savings I had promised to protect and telling them, carefully, that no one's account would be left permanently damaged. I cannot overstate how hard that part was. Some of our employees were shocked. Some were angry. One of our designers cried in my office because she had only recently started contributing enough to think seriously about retirement. Our bookkeeper, who had always assumed the outside administrator would catch any issue before it became real, looked physically sick when she heard. Nobody screamed at me, but several people asked the same question in different forms. How could this happen here? I did not have a satisfying answer. The truth was that it happened because trust can be exploited by the person closest to the machinery. We used company funds to make the employees whole as quickly as possible, and when that was not enough, I took out a personal loan to cover the remainder. I did that because the people who worked for us did not sign up to be collateral damage in Thaddeus's collapse. Whatever else happened between us, their retirement savings could not be the thing that stayed broken. I still remember sitting in the bank office, signing my own loan paperwork, and feeling a strange, bitter irony. The only reason I was borrowing money personally was to repair damage caused by someone who had stolen from other people in order to feed an addiction he should have admitted long before it reached this point. Thaddeus was formally charged with ERISA fraud and forgery. The phrase looked severe on paper. In real life, it meant interviews, records requests, legal notices, and the grinding certainty that every excuse had already been lost. He did not fight the evidence for long. There was too much of it. Cornelius had mapped the deposits. The administrator had the unsigned? No, the forged documents. The internal authorization trail showed gaps and irregularities. The pattern of withdrawals lined up with gambling losses so neatly that denial would have required him to dispute reality itself. He eventually entered a guilty plea in exchange for restitution and a permanent bar from ever serving in a fiduciary role over an employee benefit plan again. The plea did not make the betrayal smaller. It made it final. At some point after the case moved forward, Cornelius told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He said employee retirement plan fraud is taken so seriously because the victims are usually people with no awareness of the danger until it is already in motion. He compared it to a shared checking account between two business owners, where at least everyone understands the risk exists. But employee retirement savings are different. Those workers did not choose the game. They were never informed they were playing. They trusted the company to behave like a steward. When that trust is broken, the harm lands on people who had no role in creating the danger and no way to protect themselves from it. He also told me the forgery mattered a great deal, not because forgery adds color to the story, because it showed intention. Forgery meant he knew what he was doing was unauthorized. Forgery meant he understood that if I saw the true paperwork, I would stop him. Forgery meant he made a deliberate choice to conceal the theft from the one person who could have interrupted it. In the eyes of prosecutors, that kind of concealment turns a bad situation into an aggravated one. It is not confusion. It is calculated evasion. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about how many times I had thanked him for handling the back office. I thought about every meeting where he had calmly assured me that compliance was under control. I thought about how easy it had been for me to accept his competence because I had been busy, and because trust feels efficient until it is weaponized. The fallout inside the company was complicated. We kept operations going, but the atmosphere changed. You can repair a balance sheet and still leave a bruise in the culture. People who had once walked into my office laughing now knocked more carefully. Vendor conversations became more formal. Our team stopped assuming decisions were made in the background for the collective good. I could not blame them. If I had been an employee, I would have had questions too. I spent a lot of nights after work alone in the office, looking at old photographs from company events and trying to identify the exact point where I had mistaken reliability for integrity. There are signs in hindsight, almost always. They just do not look like signs until you know what they were pointing to. I had seen Thaddeus become more guarded. I had noticed he was less willing to discuss personal finances than he used to be. I had heard the stress in his voice when small, unexpected expenses came up, but each of those details had seemed explainable. People get private. People get tired. People have bad seasons. The part that still bothers me most is not that I trusted him. It is that he used my trust as cover. Eventually, I bought out his remaining stake in the agency. The valuation reflected the damage he had done, both to the finances and to the company's reputation. That was another painful piece. Even if we survived the theft and restored the money, we could not pretend nothing had happened. Trust with employees had been shaken. Some clients heard rumors and asked careful questions. We lost one account that I suspect was never coming back once they learned the full story. Small businesses can survive a lot, but reputation damage spreads through a local network in ways you feel for years. Thaddeus signed the buyout paperwork without looking at me. I did not look at him either. There was no dramatic goodbye. There was no final apology that fixed anything. He had already used up whatever emotional language we had once shared. By the time he was out of the partnership, he was simply someone who had been close enough to injure the company from the inside. Running the agency alone was harder than running it with him, but it was also cleaner. Painful, yes. Lonely, yes. But cleaner. I no longer had to wonder whether I was being told the truth about administrative processes that I had not personally handled. I hired an independent third-party administrator with strict controls and made sure the retirement plan required dual authorization verified through a secure digital signature system. No more informal approvals. No more "I took care of it." No more blind spots created by convenience. If the safeguard felt excessive to anyone else, I never argued. Excessive is a small price when the alternative is being robbed through a document you thought you already understood. I also changed how I thought about partnership itself. I used to think the best partnerships were built on complementing weaknesses. You let the other person handle what you do not want to handle. That can work, but only if both people remain accountable. Now I think a healthy partnership needs more than division of labor. It needs overlapping visibility. It needs friction in the right places. It needs a structure that assumes people can fail because they can, and that failure can be ordinary or catastrophic depending on how much access they have. When I speak about this now, usually to other business owners who have never thought much about benefit plan controls, I try not to sound preachy. I do not tell them to distrust everyone. Distrust is not a strategy. But I do tell them to build systems that do not depend on the assumption that the most convenient person is also the most ethical one. I tell them to read the plan documents. I tell them to verify signatures. I tell them never to let one person control the entire chain from request to approval to disbursement. And I tell them that a little inconvenience is not the same thing as a real safeguard. If I sound sharper about it now, that is because I have already paid for the lesson. The years since have not erased what happened. They have simply given it shape. The agency is still here. The team is smaller now, but steadier. We rebuilt trust with the people who stayed, and we made changes that were expensive but necessary. I cannot say the office feels the same. It does not. It is more careful, more deliberate, less naive. But perhaps that is what survival looks like when you discover that the person who knew your systems best was the one willing to abuse them. I think often about the first moment when the administrator told me my signature had appeared on documents I had never approved. That was the moment my old understanding of the business ended. Everything after that was response. There is no easy lesson in it, except maybe this. Money is not the only thing people steal when they abuse trust. They steal time, certainty, and the version of the world where your good faith still means something. Rebuilding the numbers was possible. Rebuilding the sense of safety took longer, and some of it will probably never come back in the same form. But our employees kept their retirement savings. That mattered most. And when I look at the new controls, the independent administrator, the dual signatures, and the digital verification, I do not see bureaucracy. I see the cost of learning that a business partner can smile at you across a conference table while forging your name to cover gambling losses and draining the money meant to protect other people's futures. I see why the system had to change. I see what it protected us from the second time. I do not miss the old version of trust. I miss believing it was enough. There are still moments when I catch myself almost defending him in my head, which is a humiliating thing to admit. Not because I think he deserves it, but because memory is lazy and likes to simplify people into the roles they once played for us. I remember the years when he was useful, capable, and steady, and my mind tries to hold that version beside the one who chose theft. I have learned that both versions can be true. That is the part I dislike most. It would be easier if he had been bad all along. It would be simpler if there had been no overlap between the man who helped build our company and the man who destroyed my ability to trust him. But that is not how betrayal works. It usually arrives wearing competence. It usually hides inside a relationship that already has momentum. After the buyout, I had to explain the new controls to our payroll vendor, our administrator, and anyone else who had even partial visibility into the plan. Every conversation felt like a small confession. I kept using the words safeguard and verification because I was fooled by someone I trusted is not a phrase that helps a vendor process paperwork. Still, a few people understood more than I said. One longtime client sent me a private note that simply read, "You handled this the right way." I kept that message because on the rough days it reminded me that accountability can still be recognized even when it comes too late to prevent harm. Cornelius checked in a few months later to tell me that the restitution process was moving as expected and that the remaining financial documentation was in order. Priscilla did the same, mostly to make sure there were no procedural surprises waiting further down the line. By then, the legal fear had been replaced by something quieter and more exhausting: maintenance. Maintenance on the business, maintenance on the plan, maintenance on my own mind. It is remarkable how long a nervous system can stay on alert after a betrayal. Even after the numbers are repaired, the body keeps waiting for the next emergency. I wish I could say I became a different kind of person because of what happened. The truth is more practical. I became a more suspicious one in the useful sense. I ask to see things now, I verify. I do not assume the paperwork matches the story just because the speaker sounds confident. If that makes me harder to work with, so be it. I would rather be temporarily inconvenient than permanently blind. When I lock up the office at night, I sometimes look back at the windows and think about all the ordinary days that came before the call. That is what makes the whole thing feel unreal. Not the fraud itself, which was very real, but the fact that it lived inside such normal routines. Client emails, staff lunches, quarterly planning. A man I had known for years asking me how my day was going, while hiding a paper trail that led straight to gambling sites and forged signatures. The cruelty of it is that nothing about the surface looked like disaster until disaster had already happened. If there is one final thing I learned, it is that you do not measure the safety of a system by how good the people in it seem. You measure it by what they can do if they stop being good.